Right, we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Jen Falaska. I run marketing here at ECI. Welcome to our webinar. We have both chat and our Q&A function enabled. We hope that this is an interactive conversation. Joining us today, we have Rich Itri, who's the Chief Innovation Officer here at ECI, along with Chad Fullerton, who's our VP of InfoSec. The two of them are going to talk about text messaging, archiving, and the compliance that comes with it. So with that, I'll turn things over to Rich and we'll get started.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen mentioned, Rich Itri, the Chief Innovation Officer here at ECI. For those of you who don't know me, I've been with ECI now about 4.5 years, but prior to joining ECI, I was CTO at an investment bank for about 5 years and then CIO at several hedge funds. So this topic is, very close to my heart because I've probably been dealing with it for the last 12 years of my career. And again, joining me is Chad Fullerton, our VP of cybersecurity here at ECI. Chad runs our GRC program. And as you can imagine, this is a big part of, governance, risk, and compliance for our registered investment advisors. Chad, you probably come across this topic quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of people are worried about, and I think we'll, more so worried along the lines of, hey, we want to enable our team and our team members to do business, right? We don't want to restrict people's ability to function, but we have compliance obligations that we have to meet. It's not optional. So kind of how do we get to that solution, right?
Yeah. And I think, this is a good time then to kind of jump into the problem a bit, right? So look, this issue has been brought up, I think, as I mentioned, I've been dealing with it, I feel like for at least 12, 13 years. But post-pandemic, the SEC really got, strict around text messaging for business purposes. I think they saw a lot of it going on during the pandemic, and they really wanted to begin to crack down on it. So they started off by going after the big banks, right? So they went after the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans of the world, and they fined them very heavily, right? Everyone knows the size fines, they got. And over the last, I would say, year and a half, the SEC has finally worked their way down to the smaller registered investment advisors. So if you look at it over the last, 18 months, there's been a lot of fines coming down, in the smaller, registered investment advisor space. And that tells you that, the SEC is really serious about this, and it's something that they're going to be looking at on an ongoing basis, right? The problem always sounds easy to solve for, right? And I think, when you think about some of the challenges around, solving for this issue, it's not so much around logging of the text messages, but it's, do you have corporate devices, right? Are you doing BYOD? People like using, certain interfaces for text versus other interfaces, so there's a number of challenges that make this difficult, to implement. And we'll kind of go into some of those today and what some of the solutions are. But again, I think the biggest issues are, electronic communications, including text, have to be logged in worm format, right? That's one challenge. Second piece is, a lot of our employees like to use common interfaces like Apple and interfaces that are embedded in Android, which make it a little bit challenging. And then to kind of complicate that, you have BYOD over corporate devices. What does that look like when you're BYOD versus corporate? Do you have different responsibilities as an organization around corporate devices versus BYOD? I think you do. I think the regulators think you do. We will go into that, in the presentation. But generally speaking, those are kind of the high level, challenges that we see across our clients and that I have from experience. Chad, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think we'll go into detail a little bit more on each of those here shortly, but I think that covers the landscape pretty well.
Yeah. So generally speaking, there's 3 ways to address this, right? The kind of old school way, the way that's like many people are still addressing this is, not allowing text messaging for business purposes, right? And, although that sounds like a simple solution, I used to have this saying to my team that, employees are like water. They always find the path of least resistance. So even if you prohibit it, they're still going to use it, and the SEC is still going to hold you accountable, right? So that one, although a lot of people are using it, I think more people are coming to terms with the fact that it's probably no longer valid, right? That, there's risk in still going down that road, but look, it's still an option, right? And everything is a risk-based decision, right? The next is third-party apps, right? So there's a number of third-party apps. We'll talk about some of them today, that are out there that allow you to do the text messaging for business purposes, and it'll funnel all of those messages into your electronic archive like Global Relay or Smarsh, and you'll have that all in one place. There's pros and cons right around doing that, and we'll go into that in some of the next slides. And then, the third option, right, is, issuing corporate devices. So going back to the days when you had two devices. So when it's a corporate device, we can lock that device down at a very granular level, right? So we could prevent iMessage from even working. We could funnel everything through text messaging and then capture all those text messages and feed them into your electronic archive. Makes it a little easier, but again, who wants to carry two devices, in this day and age? There's some debate around that. Some people like it. Generally speaking, most people like to keep just one device, right? And, but again, like, these are kind of the three options that, we see in the marketplace and that we advise, clients around. So next slide. So again, thoughts on the various approaches, right? Corporate devices, as I mentioned, right? You're going to have to go out and buy devices. So there's a cost there. And these devices are not cheap, right? You then also need, other technologies as well, right? So on Android, there's specific software you need. For Apple, you have to get Apple Business Manager so you can lock those devices down, put a corporate image on there, prevent certain things from happening like iMessage and funnel that, through text messaging. So you get rid of the little blue bubble and you switch to green bubbles, which people don't like either, right? Which is probably a separate, conversation. Or you continue down the BYOD channel, right? But you really force people to use, right, a singular app, right, that you sanction in the organization, and that you, right, log from a electronic archive perspective. In both scenarios, it's still strongly suggested that you have employees attest to the fact that they're not using any other device or number, right, for text messaging, right, just to kind of round things out, right? As we all know, like, we want this, if you're going to go and implement this technology, you want to put some controls around it as well and make sure that we're holding our users accountable, right, for using the technology or the platform that we distribute to communicate in this way. Chad, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the corporate devices as well, I think, one of the benefits you get to that is there are other security benefits you can reap from that you can't necessarily reap on the BYOD side, which we can talk a little bit more later. But there is obviously additional complications and costs to that. And I think on the BYOD side, even though that attestation is still a piece of the pie here versus the attestation of we're just not going to use text at all, if you've at least enabled users to have some form of ability, right, your attestation goes a lot further versus just saying like, hey, we're not going to do it, attestation complete, right? Who really believes you? Versus if you give somebody that tool that kind of says, hey, we're going to use this tool and this is the only tool we're going to use. Now we're going to attest that we didn't break that rule. There at least is a path, right? Now, whether users are going to follow that or not, it's another conversation. But you at least gave some type of kind of path to compliance there. People are going to believe that attestation a little stronger.
Yeah. And, Chad, I think one of the biggest things here too is, whatever direction you decide to go, making sure that you update all of your policies and procedures and controls, right? Making sure that your acceptable use policy clearly states how to use corporate devices, right, and in what manner, and that you're just fully disclosing that you're logging, these text messages, right, in your electronic archive for regulatory purposes.
Yeah, and having your employees review and sign off on those policies annually, right? You can't just kind of write it once and say, hey, here you go. Even that attestation is going to refer to a policy that's going to say, hey, per our policy X, right? Now you need to attest that you've read said policy. This is where that policy is located for employees to review. That policy better be updated annually, reviewed, signed off on, because, if you go into an audit that's going to call that stuff to question, they're not going to just take it for, your word on it that you reviewed it. You need to have sign-off columns. You need to have these things that you've gone through and be able to prove that, right? Otherwise, if they find one thing, they're going to look for 10 more, right?
Right. And, look, if there ever is an issue and the SEC is doing an investigation or comes in to do a discovery, and and the employee says, well, like I haven't, my firm hasn't, updated our acceptable use policy. I wasn't aware that that was our policy. You don't want to get into that kind of, back and forth around things, right? You want to create accountability, down to the employees. So next slide, Jen. Challenges, right? So we talked a little bit about like what they are. When you think about not allowing it at all, right? They're still likely going to use text messaging for business purposes. It's become a almost accepted use of communication. The other challenge is that like we also deal with a lot of other companies in our space that aren't regulated, right? So, and they're used to using text messaging for business purposes, right? So it's not just that like, people want to behave in like a malintent way, right? They might be dealing with other organizations, right, that don't have the same regulatory standards that we have to operate in. And that's a comfortable form of communication for them. So we have to, as a business, kind of accept that and figure out a way to work with it, right? The other piece is, and this happens a lot, and many of you are probably looking for this in your email discoveries and your chat discoveries, right? But, things like text me or WhatsApp or like common phrases that imply to use another form of communication. When the regulators come in to like do discoveries and examinations and they pull your email archive, they're looking for those keywords as well, right? And if they find those, they're going to expect that you log those text messages, right? So now they're going to say, hey, show us your text messaging archive as well, or we noticed text messages weren't included in there. What's going on? What's your policy, right? It's going to create challenges, right? The other piece is, if there is, any kind of investigation, if there's a legal hold, depositions, happening, they're going to ask employees questions around what forms of communication did they use, right? And if they're put under oath, right, they're going to have to say they use text messaging, right? So again, the not allowing employees to do it and making it a hard, fast policy is becoming more and more of, a thing of the past, right? Firms are acknowledging the fact that it's a challenge, but still a road that you could go down. Next option, Jen. So next one we talked about was third-party apps. And this is a very common, solution to the problem, right? The pros around that are messages are logged directly into the electronic archive, right? So if you're using a third-party app and they're using the app on a regular basis, right, it's great. All the messages go directly into the archive, just like your email. You can create specific rules to, audit those, messages. So very easy to kind of, work with. If you've deployed, your MDM properly, which you should ahead of time if you haven't, right? So things like Intune, AirWatch, those platforms, you should have that deployed up and running to standard. So you could publish that app through the MDM tool. And this way you have it in a secure container as well. So when employees leave their organization, you could wipe that and all of its content, from the device. The other big piece is that there's data privacy from a personal perspective, right? So whether you're bringing your own device or it's on a corporate device, all those text messages are going to be isolated to that application and it's going to be logged. It's not going to log any of your personal messages. And we'll get into like, some of the challenges around iMessage. But again, like that third-party app is really a great solution in that regard. And many of the third-party apps also have a desktop application. So if you're at your desk and you don't want to be looking at your phone all the time, you could reply to messages, create new messages through, a desktop application or a web interface, right? Which is helpful as well. Cons are, most of these apps, all of them, the ones that I've seen require a new phone number, right? And I've seen some people try and port over the desktop number. You can do that in some cases. But one of the things that people get frustrated with is having to share updated contact information, right? So having to now send out and say, hey, this is a new number I have. Please add this to your contacts. That first time people may not recognize the number, concerns around that, right? The other argument is, people get very used to the native experience on a lot of the messaging apps in Apple and Android. And the third-party apps, although they try and replicate it, it's never 100% the same. The other complaint is it's another app, another place to go to look at messages. Now I got email, I have this thing, I have Teams, we got Zoom, right? People are like, I wish I had one place to go, for this, right? And actually, some of these third-party text messaging apps now also integrate in Teams, right? So you can have that number up in Teams. So when you're on your desk, you have everything, consolidated in one place. But those are things to kind of think about, right, as you're moving forward. And then one of the last items that I think is a big issue is some of the syncing of contacts, right? So how do you now get your contacts that you have, on your phone that you spend so much time kind of curating and syncing? How do you allow those third-party apps to access that? Some of those apps do, some of them don't. There's security concerns around having the apps access those things. So those are just some of the cons and considerations that you have to think about with, third-party apps. Next one.
Yeah, and I think, on the third-party apps thing, Rich, right? I think like if you do it correctly, I think you can mitigate some of those cons and actually almost turn those into pros, right? I think, you talked about having another place people have to go to look for things or another place people have to go to communicate, right? If in theory, if they're not going to texting because they're going to their third-party app, right, they shouldn't be going to texting. So there isn't that other place to look for text messages, right? They should be doing it through this application versus if they're doing it natively in text, they'd have to go to that application as well on their phone, right? And then I think that if you do sync those things properly, where you are using the application on your desktop, or you do integrate it to Teams, and if you're going out and sourcing these tools, if these are requirements that you have in your sourcing process, you can actually, through good user training, make it to where a user doesn't actually have to look at their phone in the middle of their workday because everything's right there. Then obviously if they go on the move, there's tablets, there's things like that, again, you can potentially integrate into, Teams there as well. And maybe even cut down the amount of applications people have to look at, right? Kind of almost enable people to have that one source of communication, even if it's through multiple channels, right? It's kind of brought together. At least from if you source it right and if you establish it correctly the first time, you can almost give people that capability, even if they do have some drawbacks like having to change their number, not having blue text messages, right? Some of those oh so terrible pain points that we have. If you enable other features, you might get a little more buy-in.
Yeah. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned tablets, right? Because I think here, when we talk about corporate devices, I'll jump to some of the cons. But, we take for granted that when you're in a BYOD framework, many people are putting, their work assets on an iPad, right, that they have already, or maybe the firm had purchased one, in the past. When you go to corporate devices, not only do you have to buy phones, but there are professionals you're going to have to buy iPads for, right? Like that cost becomes exponential, right? And iPads cost more than iPhones. And you're going to have to buy the latest. You're still going to have to purchase other software as well. So you're going to need to get Apple Enterprise Manager, right, which is not cheap. You're going to need to make sure your MDM is fully deployed. So again, and it's still going to be a new number, right? So some of the challenges that you have with the third-party apps, you're still going to have with corporate devices, and you could incur extra charges, right, because you have to buy new devices and tablets, right? And those are all valid concerns. And I know organizations that have gone down this road, and it's been expensive. Right. So you have to, I think, when understanding the pros and cons, it's a usability thing. Like, what do you think is attractive to your organization? And then what is your budget to actually tackle this? Right. Because when you talk about the other software layer, like firms like Global Relay and Smart charge you to ingest that data. Right. Now, they may also have their own third-party apps, and we'll talk about what some of those solutions are shortly. And that's on top of it, right? So they're going to charge you for the third-party app, and you're going to get a charge ingestion, right? So you really got to think about what your budget is for these types of initiatives as well, and then what options align, with your organization the best. One thing that I think we didn't mention up front, this whole presentation will be available in the ECI portal. So you'll be able to log into our client portal and you can download this deck. I think it would be helpful as you're kind of going through your journey to understand, all the pros and cons. And you may want to use some of this content in your own internal messaging. Next slide, Jane. So logging on BYOD, right? Log everything, including iMessage, right? Messages are logged directly into electronic archive, right? Manage contacts via MDM platform, which many people are currently doing, right? Still use their existing device, right? The issue with, one of the biggest cons, right, around some of this is, again, like new phone number, users having to enter, right? So to log iMessage on a BYOD device, you have to enter your iCloud information into the third-party app, because the way that a lot of these work is they use your backup, right, your real-time backup from iCloud, and they restore it to the archive, right? So it's really an unfiltered, so you're getting all of your kind of text message in there. You lose a little semblance of like data privacy, and not a lot of people are very comfortable like putting their iCloud information in so that, those messages are locked, right? So, even though there's solutions to logging iMessage, on a BYOD device, it's still really not ideal. And, look, a lot of organizations don't want to ingest any more information than they need to, right? So, at the end of the day, we don't really want to see all people's personal, iMessage information in our archives anyway, right? Like if it comes up where you're doing a discovery or a keyword search, you have no idea what's going to pop up then, right? So to me, this one is not necessarily a valid option, but some organizations may want to consider it.
And I think, on this one, right, like you do have to be upfront with your employees that you are capturing all of this information. It does have to be written into your policies. Employees do have to sign off that they understand that this is the case. And I think that is going to turn a lot of people off. And I think that if you're giving people the option of, hey, you're going to have a green chat bubble, or I'm going to capture all of your personal chats and archive those, people may start to sway a different way than they may up front. Everybody wants blue text messages until you have their personal conversations with their wives archived in your or husbands, right, archived in your chat system. And I think, I won't go down the rabbit hole of privacy, but I think, being aware of local and international privacy regulations is incredibly important when you're capturing this information, right? You may open yourself up to different privacy regulations that are outside of your normal business operation because you're capturing personal information there.
Now, I have seen some organizations issue corporate devices, allow iMessage, and create new iCloud accounts for those employees so that they are using iMessage and the native functionality within iMessage, but it's a separate account. And since it's on a corporate device, the assumption is that you're only using it for business purposes. So anything logged there will only be business, communications. And we really shouldn't be pregnant with any other data that we may not want to have inside, the company. But it goes back to that kind of, corporate device versus, BYOD. Next slide, Jay.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about that corporate device stuff too, Rich, like I think what some organizations think they can do is they think, hey, well, I'll just buy a device, right? But I won't do all that security stuff. I won't get that Apple Business Manager, right? I won't incur all that extra cost there. I'll just give somebody a phone so that they can not use it as a personal phone, right? But I think, when regulators come in, one, again, policies have to match reality here. And you can't necessarily call that a corporate device, even if the business purchased it. If it doesn't have any of the corporate management software on there, it really is going to be treated like a BYOD device. And if there's no regulations that make it not so, that's the way it's going to be seen and treated, whether no matter who paid the bill at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. And just to kind of touch on some of the like prerequisites and other considerations, we talked a lot about this, I think, throughout each one of the options, but I thought it'd be good to kind of summarize it into, one page. You need a fully operational mobile device management platform deployed. So if you've been putting it off, now's the time to get that done. It's also, something that is stated clearly in the new SEC cyber security rule as well, which I think Chad will be codified sometime in the next century. But in any case, it's certainly in there and mentioned. So if you're not doing it now, you need to. You're going to need to license, the consumption layer with Global Relay or Smarsh. So they're going to charge more for that. You're going to need to speak with your rep. We have a strategic relationship with Global Relay. We help our clients set this up. It's something that we can help facilitate, but it is additional licensing. If you're going to go down the road of logging iMessage, you're going to need to purchase Apple Business Manager. And to be honest, if you're going to do corporate devices and their iPhones, you're going to need to purchase Business Manager either way, so you can manage those images on those phones and manage the OSs that are on there as well, and provide updates to those devices as needed. You're also going to need to create new rules, right, as part of your compliance program. So the types of content that's sent over text is a bit different than email. There are different keywords you might want to look for. A lot of the providers have come up with some AI tooling now to help better identify, some of the key terms, right, in text and email as well. But you're going to have to make changes there. And then last, if you're not addressing the issue with how you share contacts, right, in your MDM platform, this is probably the time to do that as well, right? If you're not using, the native Outlook app, or, you're using native iOS, and, syncing contacts, right, can be a challenge. You're going to need to kind of address this, here as well. All right. So some solutions that are in the market today, and again, this is not like a holistic list of providers, but these are ones that, we are familiar with, and we can certainly, have deeper conversations with you around, what makes sense for your organization. And if you want to look at the different providers, we could help facilitate meetings for you on your behalf and help you with the integration. But, look, I'm leading with Global Relay. A lot of our clients use Global Relay for the logging of, electronic communications already. Their app is pretty good. It's just as good as many of the other apps that are out there. Since you already have Global Relay as your electronic archive provider, it's easier to kind of create the integration, the paperwork, and the process. So if you're running Global Relay, and you haven't looked at their mobile app, I suggest you do, right? Because it is a fast to market solution. CellTrust, again, is very similar. They have integration into, Global Relay. They also have a desktop app, as well. And I think they integrate with Teams and Slack. Next slide. DeepView is another really good platform. Again, third-party app, very, very rich in terms of functionality, really good security, data privacy, integrates with all of the popular platforms as well. So if you wanted to use channels like WhatsApp or Telegram or other types of things, you can. The other big thing that, if you're in the UK, you need to be logging phone calls. DeepView has the ability to do that, as well. They have different offerings there that align with the global regulatory environment. Another great, application, and it integrates with, Global Relay and Smarsh. Leap Expert is very similar as well. They support iMessage, WhatsApp, Teams, Slack, varying other kind of platforms, similar to some of the others that we spoke about. They also specifically call out the ability to log with Bloomberg Vault as well. So I've noticed some of these providers don't all have integration with Bloomberg Vault. So if you're using Vault, that's something you might want to consider as you're evaluating, some of these vendors. Next one. Movius, again, they remind me very much of DeepWatch as well. Another good solution. Integrates with Global Relay as well. There's additional costs there for a lot of these third parties, because you got to remember, Global Relay is also trying to drive you to use their app. So they're going to charge additional fees when you try and integrate some of these other third parties into the platform. They also have some cool features that integrate with your CRM as well, which, for investor relations and others, in your organization, that might be, an attractive option. Again, very, stable platform, data secure, data privacy built in. So something to consider if you're looking for some additional like bells and whistles around the solution that you're deploying. And then, look, we'll end here with, WhatsApp through TeleMessage. Many of you are familiar with that. That was one of the original ones that, were around. TeleMessage supports a couple of other platforms as well. Keep in mind that most of these that say they support WhatsApp, it's WhatsApp for business. So it ends up being a different phone number anyway. It just ends up being that same interface that you get to use. So if your users are comfortable with using WhatsApp, that's, a great, avenue to pursue. And, TeleMessage is fairly mature. They've been around for a while. And then, Wire is a secure app integration into, many of the archiving platforms. They support video and a couple of other things. I don't see it heavily used, but I do know some organizations that have been using it now for a few years and are fairly happy with it. So with that, I think, Chad and I have probably chatted enough about, the different options and what's out there. I think, what we wanted to do is really make this interactive and open up the floor to questions. So,
Rich, we do have one that did come in. Does the SEC requirement for logged and warm format apply to ERAs or just RIAs? Too many letters there.
I believe it's both. I am not, the kind of legal and compliance expert, but I believe it is, both.
Yeah, I think it gets a little nuanced with the record keeping rule and how the record keeping rule applies to ERAs. It's also something that the SEC has commented on, kind of evaluating how the record keeping rule is going to apply to ERAs. It's not as simple as, does or does not apply. It's kind of bits and pieces. Most people consider the record keeping rule to not apply to ERAs, but it does get more nuanced than that. So I think I would go specifically into that. It also is considered best practice even for ERAs to do, proper record keeping and follow the record keeping act, or the record keeping rule. So I'd strongly advise for it. I think you could potentially get away with not doing it immediately, but it is something that should be a roadmap item, if nothing else.
While we're waiting for other questions to come in, I think to kind of reiterate some of the stuff that we talked about in the beginning, many companies have been, kind of tabling this item for, I'll look at it next year, I'll look at it next year. I think it's next year, right? It's time to address this. If you do get, the SEC to come in for an examination, they're going to ask about this, right? And, the policy is saying that you don't allow it, I think used to be acceptable. I don't think it's going to be acceptable much longer. So the time to probably begin to address this is now. And I think, look, the solutions, 3 years ago aren't what they are today. There's a lot of options. We tried to lay them out today in a clear way, but I think there's something here that could fit like every organization. This is a lot to kind of take in, right, in a short amount of time. That's why we're going to post this presentation to, our portal. And again, I strongly suggest if you have questions, reach out to your account team. Chad and I are, certainly available to jump on a call and talk you through like what we're seeing and look at your environment and figure out what might make sense for your organization, right? Because not every company is different. So not every solution is going to be so cookie cutter, but I think we can work with you and find the right balance. So
we do have we have a couple coming in. The first is just what would you say is the best solution for ISMS?
Yeah, look, I think we want to avoid kind of like leaning into like any one vendor. I will say that my recommendation would be, all things being equal, if you're running Global Relay already, their solution out of the box is pretty robust, somewhat cost effective, quick to deploy. And now you have everything centralized in like one archive. So I would lean into that. If you're looking for like other functionality, or you want to be, you want different applications to be supported, like WhatsApp and other things, then, I really like, Movius and Deepwatch.
Excellent. Quick question about Global Relay. Do they offer native iMessage archiving similar to Leap Expert? And does ECR's GR solution bundle include this feature?
So they will have, I believe it's in beta right now, a native iMessage archiving similar to Leap Expert. I don't think it's GA at the moment. When it is GA, we've had the opportunity to kind of look at it, validate it. We will add it to our bundle going forward. Here's another one.
Given recent enforcement activities and the professed rationale for the fines that are piled, do you think BYOD is even an option anymore?
I do. I think it's an option. I think you have to. I think it comes down to the deployment of BYOD. So I think to be like, specific, I see a lot of client environments. I've been doing this for a long time. People implement MDM, in a loose way to a degree, right? As not to perceive to have a heavy hand. You have to implement all of the controls, containerize your applications, and make sure things are linked to onboarding and offboarding. Like you have to have a cohesive process around it. And I think Chad's laughing because Chad runs our GRC program, and I think this is a topic, Chad, that like we walk through. But I think if done right, it's certainly an option. I know people get a little, concerned around it, especially data privacy and AI right now. One of the things we've been working with clients around is updating our BYOD profile to prevent data from going from your apps on your phone into Apple Intelligence, right? So again, like these are things that like you have to stay on top of, right? Because your data can move between apps. So you have to have the right controls and the right configuration for MDM deployed, right? And then it's something I think that I can get comfortable with. But Chad, I'm sure you want to add to that.
No, I think like you hit the nail, right? It's if done properly, BYOD is here to stay. But BYOD, just like anything else, if done improperly, is a black hole of failure, right? And I think like Apple Intelligence is a great example, Rich, right? Like if you're not containerizing your apps and if you're using like native mail apps or native calendar, that links to Apple Intelligence in the new features, right? So now you're potentially, right? Like no one says yes or no. It's all kind of like potentially your corporate data could be open to train the, AI for Apple. Right now it's stored in who knows where. Where are Apple's data storage locations? I don't know. We don't know. So your data is now where, right? But if proper MDM, right, proper BYOD configuration, containerization of applications, things like that, it can be fine, right? It's probably here to stay. And it's the same that goes to corporate devices. If you go to a corporate device and you don't configure these same settings, it doesn't matter that it's a corporate device, right? You've just opened up all the same problems. So whether it's corporate or BYOD, it's all about the proper deployment and having that expertise, right, to kind of ensure that you do follow that proper deployment.
Mm-hmm. We have another good question here, Jen.
Yep. I'm familiar of the cases that led to the requirements. Where is the line in terms of the intent and examination of in-scope and out-of-scope employee and activities? I think we already handled BYOD, though.
Well, I could talk to the recommended mix as well. I think that's hard to distinguish at the moment. I think there's really not, if you're communicating with investors, anyone on the investment side, portfolio companies, bankers, I mean, we could run through the list. All of that stuff, right, would have to be logged. I think one of the challenges is like saying what's in scope and out of scope, like that becomes hard. And then now you're creating too much of a judgment. So that concept used to be like very common, meaning, hey, if it's this type of message, go take it and send it in an email so that you have it archived. I think we've kind of moved away from that because you're relying on the user to make a judgment call that I'm not sure the regulators will accept, right, in the long term. I think in terms of the mix of BYOD and non-BYOD, I have seen people do both, right? So, for example, if you have some C-levels who want to keep using their device and they don't want to use a third-party app, right? And we know how some of the executives are, right? You can go with a hybrid model where you're implementing corporate devices, logging that information as I've kind of laid out, right? And create a framework for that. And then you can deploy third-party apps as well. That's acceptable if you're willing to invest in both to satisfy, your business requirements. Then you could certainly do both. And that's acceptable. Again, there's just some costs involved in doing that and some operational overhead, but both are acceptable. Got a lot of good questions today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Last call for questions. Looks like we are ready to wrap up, Rich.
Yeah, no, it's good. And again, we're going to make the presentation available. And if there's anything we didn't cover today, you have access to your account team. We're always a resource to sit down, talk through these things with you, like they're important decisions. We want to bring whatever kind of, experience we have, as well as, our purview across other clients and, give you, the right guidance so you're making the right decisions for for your company and you're investing in the right technologies. So hopefully you found this useful today. I know Chad and I enjoy talking about these types of things. So we thank you for your time and, have a great day.
Thanks all.